A place to call home. A place to feel special. A place to be loved. For most children, this place is in the embrace of family. They grow up knowing that they belong and who they belong to. But for some children, whether because their families have been torn by death, illness, or abuse, living at home is just not an option, at least for a time. For children caught tangled in complicated family situations, care outside their natural homes might be necessary. For some, this may be provided in a foster home. According to the Children's Defense Fund, there were more than 435,000 children in foster care in the United States in 2020. But for others, the best option for care may be on a residential campus. One of these is Connie Maxwell Children's Home in Greenwood, South Carolina. Children have been finding hope and healing here for more than a century. There have always been children who have needed care from those outside their birth families. As early as the 14th century, various religious orders and European cities established foundling hospitals and orphanages to care for children in response to plagues and increasing poverty. But few orphanages existed in colonial America and the early United States before the 19th century. An Indian massacre at Natchez led the Ursuline Sisters, a French Catholic order, to turn their school in New Orleans into an orphanage in 1734. Two others opened a few years later in Georgia. By and large, orphaned or abandoned children who could not find shelter with relatives became indentured to foster families. Their physical support was tied directly to their ability to work. It was the Industrial Revolution that sparked the real growth in childcaring institutions. The problem of orphaned and homeless children became too large to be solved by indentured service. Poor immigrant workers often died from illness or accidents, or were forced to abandon children during periods of unemployment. By the early 19th century, just over 24 orphanages were open, mostly in large cities. But this number began to grow steadily from the 1830s on.
Between around 1830 and 1850, there's around 56 children's institutions that are started throughout the United States, so not just in the South. But that was the main source to kind of deal with abandoned children. They would be seen more as temporary places for the children to go until other family members could be located or until they could be adopted out or placed out, either into a family that was interested in raising a child or a family that needed extra labor on their farm or situations like that.
Most orphanages were founded by religious groups in response to epidemics or warfare. And nothing created need in America like 4 years of bloody civil war. According to modern estimates, more than 750,000 people died in battle or succumbed to war-related injuries or disease between 1860 and 1865. The percentage loss would be equivalent to losing 7 million of today's U.S. population.
What's interesting, though, is that we think in terms of those military deaths. We don't ever broaden them to think of how many people die that aren't related to the military. So how many people on the home front die of diseases that the Army has brought through, famine, starvation. So there's all these unseen deaths that we don't even talk about when we're talking about those military numbers.
There are no exact figures for the number of children who entered orphanages as a result of Civil War deaths, but there were likely many thousands of war orphans. Religious groups and philanthropists in both the North and the South established orphanages in the 1860s to meet the needs. Having borne the brunt of the fighting, and with a smaller population, the Civil War hit the South especially hard. It is estimated that in South Carolina, between 31 and 35% of the state's young adult white male population died in the war.
For 13,000 families, men leave to go fight in other parts of the Confederacy and other parts of the state, and they don't come home at the end of those 4 years. The South is a very gendered society. The United States is, but the South in particular, the men of the family are the breadwinner. They interact with the outside world. They sustain the family. So to have fathers and sons and brothers go off to war and not come home, you're setting up for a very destabilizing kind of social reaction at the end of these 4 years, when all of these women are now kind of having to figure out how to do the job that they weren't raised to do. They never anticipated having to do in their lives.
But recovering was to take decades, with economic and social wounds impacting children and families long after the cannons were silenced. The Connie Maxwell Orphanage owes its birth not so much to the war itself, but to the conflict's wake. Founded in 1892, it received its name from its chief early benefactor, Dr. John Chapel Maxwell. Maxwell was a military surgeon for the Confederacy who saw action at major battles throughout the war and later served as a state senator from Abbeville County. He was a highly respected physician known both for his compassion and his brusque, decisive manner. He often traveled far outside of town treating the sick, frequently without compensation.
JC was a doctor in the community, actually had served during the Civil War, and had a compassion. People spoke of Dr. Maxwell and his compassion for taking care of the needs of others.
In addition to war, Maxwell had seen his share of family tragedy. His first wife and their child died within a year of their marriage in 1867. He then married her younger sister, only to see 3 more children die as babies. Then came Constance Pope Maxwell, a beautiful child with dark hair and eyes. Connie lived with her parents in Greenwood, just down the street from another family who had a small son. In April 1883, Maxwell was treating this young boy. Although Maxwell didn't realize it at the time, the boy, who recovered, was suffering from a particularly virulent form of scarlet fever. The disease was the scourge of the 19th century and had reached pandemic proportions in North America and Europe between 1820 and 1880. Within days, Connie had also developed the dread disease.
Scarlet fever would have started with symptoms that would be similar to strep throat. It's a common childhood complaint, right? My throat hurts. And then within just a matter of hours, you would see children that would begin to develop a rash, a very red rash, which is how scarlet fever gets its name. Children could succumb within 48 hours of exhibiting the first symptoms. So we're talking a very, very quick onset. My throat hurts, to high fever, we have a rash, to they're not with us anymore.
Today, the disease is treated with antibiotics, but no such life-saving medicine was available in 1883. She died on April 23rd, at just 7 years of age. While tragic, Connie's untimely death would ultimately give hope and new life to others. In 1888, South Carolina Baptist entered the picture of childcare when Baptist Courier editor W. W. Keyes brought the plight of children to his denomination in an editorial.
There was an overwhelming need for childcare in the late 1800s. There were a few homes here in the state that existed. And then Baptists saw the need that they needed to be becoming involved in that the need was really there for, more homes, more facilities. W. W. Keyes made the call. He said, we need to start this ministry of taking care of children because the need is great in South Carolina.
Noting that the Thornwell Orphanage, the Presbyterian orphanage in Clinton, had requests for more than 100 children beyond the 70 already in its care, Key challenged the Baptists to take action. Had it occurred to you, dear reader, that it is a department of work in which our Baptist people in South Carolina are doing nothing at all as a denomination? The editorial resonated, and 2 weeks after being published, Baptists voted overwhelmingly at their annual meeting in favor of establishing an orphanage. 11 towns vied for the privilege of hosting the new ministry with offers of cash or real estate or both. Greenwood was ultimately selected after the town pledged 10 acres and citizens pledged $2,200. The clincher was the Maxwells' offer to give the orphanage most of their estate, including some 470 acres, as a memorial for Connie upon their deaths.
So they, instead of getting angry with the world, angry with God, and turning their backs on society and the needs that existed at that time, being the people that had a great heart that they had, and I greatly appreciate, they said, we'll do this if you'll name the home Connie Maxwell. And I cannot think of a better way for a children's home to begin.
In characteristic bluntness, Maxwell did place a stipulation on his gift, however. If the Baptists do not keep up said orphanage in a more businesslike and liberal manner than they sustain their pastors, churches, and university, the will would probably be revoked. Despite the enthusiasm for caring for children, starting a ministry from the ground up would not be easy. Acute economic depression struck the country in the early 1890s, leading to the Panic of '93, when more than 500 banks and 15,000 American businesses failed. This depression was only exceeded by the Great Depression of the 1930s.
So what that means for the South is that when you're in an area that's already impoverished and struggling to recover, that those stalls are felt with much more devastating impact than if you're in other areas where you're maybe in a more industrialized area or you're more middle class and you don't feel it quite as much as if you're just trying to work the land to feed yourself.
Although reluctant to take the position at first, the Reverend J.L. Vass, pastor of the Swift Creek Church in Darlington County and chairman of the committee that recommended the Greenwood site, became the orphanage's first superintendent.
He didn't seek it. He didn't want it. Matter of fact, they were looking for a superintendent, and they just turned to him and said, you're going to be the ideal person. You're the one who's worked so hard to bring Connie Maxwell into existence. You need to be that first leader.
An impressive man with a full white beard, the 51-year-old Vass had held pastorates in Georgia and Tennessee, as well as South Carolina. Despite his commanding presence, he was unpretentious and generous. His first love is said to have been working and preaching in rural churches. On May 22, 1892, Susie Burton became the first child accepted, just 4 days after the first building was completed. She was 12 or 13 years old, but subsequent admissions were of younger children.
Susie Burton was the very first child to arrive in the care of Connie Maxwell Orphanage. But there was a lag. Johnny Weeks was going to be the first child. But when Susie arrived, he stepped aside like the proper gentleman that he should be and let her be the first one to sign in to be the very first child of Connie Maxwell.
By the end of the first year, there were 26 children in care. A decision was made early on for each building housing children, or cottages as they were called then and now, to be self-contained. Each cottage had its own kitchen and eating facilities, as well as its own cow, garden, and poultry yard. The first cottage also had a schoolroom, a room for sick children, a bedroom for the matron and the school teacher, a reception room, and the superintendent's office. Within the first 7 years, 5 cottages, a combination schoolroom and chapel, a barn, and a house for the home manager were built. These early years were not easy ones, however. The economic depression had taken full hold, and Vass found himself constantly canvassing the state soliciting funds to support and grow the orphanage. Personality conflicts with some orphanage staff and the Board of Trustees, including Dr. John Maxwell, were also challenges. Vass's strengths seemed to have been in promoting the orphanage and managing the budget, but he struggled in the day-to-day management of staff and children. Vass served until 1899, when he declined to be re-elected and returned to the pastorate. During his tenure, more than 230 children received care with an average stay of 4 years.
Dr. Vass lived in a time of almost like a new frontier. To be able to get the support to find these children's home sort of in that new frontier, it had to be amazingly rewarding that they were able to respond to those needs in such a relevant way.
Vass's departure would have been expected to leave a void, with the Board of Trustees and the South Carolina Baptist Convention split over supporting him. But in that 1899 convention, a compromise candidate emerged who would guide Connie Maxwell for the next 46 years. Little did anyone know in 1899 the impact of selecting Atha T. Jamison as the new superintendent of the Connie Maxwell Orphanage. Just 36 years old, the young pastor of the Baptist Church in Camden was described as having been no man's man and every man's man in the sides taking over Vass's leadership. In fact, he had not sought the position and was so surprised by the call that he waited 2 weeks before accepting it. Although he had attended seminary and worked with young people through the YMCA, Jamison was self-conscious about his lack of formal training for the task. Jamison was coming into the world of child care at a time of important change in the area of children's social work. Until the late 19th century, poor children were largely uneducated if they were orphaned or abandoned by their parents. These waifs and strays might be literally homeless or were cared for in the workhouse. The orphanages that existed were custodial, and children received only the most minimal care and, at most, training for menial tasks. But Jamison came to Connie Maxwell during the height of the reform movement in America. It was the time of Theodore Roosevelt's progressivism, when education was seen as the force that would accelerate the perfecting of mankind and of society.
Consider the time period from about 1900 to the 1920s. We refer to that as the progressive era. And we call it that because there are all of these different reform movements that pop up that are interested in bettering American society. it's an incredibly optimistic time period. They're looking at taking science and psychology and sociology and just everything and pooling all of their resources and just everything they have to make the United States the best version of itself that it can be.
Jamison was a strong proponent of education, but also, perhaps a bit ahead of his time, focused on children as individuals, each with unique needs. Thinking about and treating children as if they were his own adopted, Jamison insisted that an orphan child was as good as any other child and should not be thought of as unfortunate. Beyond simply meeting physical needs, Jamison also believed in the importance of recreation. Tramps through the woods, trips to see suitable moving pictures, and frequent use of the swimming pool during the summer emphasized this commitment. The new superintendent also brought with him a commitment to make use of the best new ideas developed by the social sciences. To educate himself and his staff, he frequently attended professional meetings and was the sole South Carolina representative at the first White House Conference on Children hosted by President Roosevelt in 1909. He also became one of the founders of the Child Welfare League of America. The Connie Maxwell Orphanage of the early 20th century had 5 cottages with a live-in matron who cared for an average of 24 children each. The only time off for matrons came when the children were in school. It would be almost 20 years before matrons began receiving a morning and afternoon off each week. When the new century dawned, there was no church on the campus, and at first only a few of the older children made the journey, which included crossing Hard Labor Creek on a plank to Greenwood to attend church. Instead, children attended a Sunday school taught by the gardener. That changed in 1900 when church members raised money for a wagon that could carry up to 20 children to church. It was variously known as the Prairie Schooner, Carryall, and the Gospel Wagon. Education was provided by 3 teachers who shared rooms with 3 of the matrons. The landscape of the early campus was bleak, with not a shrub, flower, or blade of grass surrounding the buildings.
I'm amazed sometimes when I look back at the old photographs of the early years of Connie Maxwell Orphanage, to see the children out in the front yard. And again, that rural South Carolina, we're used today of seeing grass and taking care of it and so forth, but then that yard was a dirt yard.
Jamison determined to change this, and early in his administration began working to beautify the campus. To address what he perceived as the bleakness of the children's lives, he insisted on providing a variety of foods, and in 1905 introduced the first modern water supply.
Dr. Jamison was always a person that loved children. They were always hanging on his legs, or he was always talking to them. And if you saw Dr. Jamison, he was always dressed up. He always had a coat on and always had a red rose in his lapel. Always.
And he was very even-tempered and was a very distinguished gentleman. When I was 5, we had little chores to do, which is good. Every youngster needs that responsibility. Anyway, we had to walk to the office, and we had a bag for the mail, pick up a lot of stuff. And I remember Dr. Jamison having an office there. Everything that I've had to do with Dr. Jamison, he always had a smile.
Maintaining children's health was always a challenge, and even as late as 1920, there were usually at least 1 or 2 children being kept isolated due to tuberculosis. Scabies, a disease associated with dirt, was the most frequently reported disease until it was overtaken by influenza during the pandemic of 1919. A significant development in the early 1900s was also the purchase of a printing press. With the press, the orphanage began publishing its own newspaper and providing vocational training for boys. Many of these boys went on to work for daily newspapers or in printing businesses. Boys also learned dairying, mattress making, farming, fruit culture, and chair caning. There was also a wood shop and shoe shop. Girls, however, were generally only taught domestic skills such as cooking, housekeeping, laundering, and sewing. A major change in the way the children's ministry was funded came in 1919 when South Carolina Baptists began to consolidate their giving to missions and ministries through what was known as the 75 Million Campaign. This campaign later became the Cooperative Program. For the first time, the orphanage would depend less on direct individual giving and more on the convention.
The cooperative program was began in 1925, and God has really blessed it. You know, and it's taken from the scriptures when Jesus says, "Inasmuch as you have done it unto me, you've done it unto the least of these, you have done it unto me." I'm a product of our cooperative program. And I said, had it not been for the cooperative program, I would not be here had it not been for them.
Another increasing form of support was in-kind gifts. A rail spur was built to the campus, which allowed churches to send carloads of produce as well as clothing and other gifts. These, along with the orphanage's own farm and other production, enabled Connie Maxwell to be sustained during lean years. The Connie Maxwell Church was organized in 1912, and Jamison agreed to serve as pastor on a temporary basis. In this case, temporary ended up meaning 34 years. The South Carolina WMU began constructing a new building for the church in 1927, which served the campus until the 1960s. As pressure on families increased due to the worsening economy, the number of children in care and the number of cottages also continued to increase. Some 220 children were in care in 9 cottages in 1910. By 1920, that number had increased to 330 in 13 cottages. Children were staying, on average, about 7.5 years. Although it wasn't visible, a significant change was occurring in the type of child served during these years at Connie Maxwell and at other orphanages across the country. Whereas the orphanage was founded to care for children whose parents had both died, the full orphan, it was not long before other family pressures were leading to care. In 1920, 80% of the children receiving care at Connie Maxwell were orphans in the true sense of the word. But by 1929, only 1/3 were. Unfortunately, however, more children were coming from single-parent homes where the death of a parent or abandonment of a spouse had led to dire economic conditions and other problems. By the time the Great Depression hit much of the country in 1930, Connie Maxwell had already been struggling financially for years. The budgets of South Carolina Baptist agencies were cut that year, and despite a substantial waiting list that was growing by about 1 each day, the orphanage was unable to accept more children.
If you think about it, Dr. Jamison also went through some very difficult years in the history of America and its economic time period. Dr. Jamison served during the Depression, and at one point they were truly struggling to even maintain caring for any children.
During this time, one of the children taken in by Dr. Jamison began showing leadership skills that would have a profound impact on the organization. On November 24, 1915, Jamison had admitted an 8-year-old boy who had already run away from one orphanage but had agreed to come to Connie Maxwell because it was his dead mother's wish. Samuel Smith. Although he did not start first grade until he was nearly 10, Sam prospered in the care of the orphanage. He began to run its recreation program even before graduating high school in 1926 and going on to Furman University. In 1932, Smith was appointed as a field representative to visit associations and Sunday schools. Part of his job was to appeal to rural people who might not be able to spare cash to, quote, plant a patch for the orphanage. Dubbed the God's Acre Plan and later broadened to support all South Carolina Baptist ministries, the program proved to be a great success, not only because of the gifts of produce, but because it gave an increasing number of people in churches across the state a direct connection to the children's ministry. During the program's peak year of 1955, 1.6 million pounds of produce was donated. As the economic situation improved for the orphanage, Jamison's thoughts were turning toward retirement. He turned 71 in 1937, and he and the board were seeing young Sam Smith, 29 by that time, as his natural successor. The board prevailed on Jamison to stay, however, both that year and again in 1942, in order to give Smith time to be seasoned in years. As the nation entered into World War II in 1941, every facet of American life was affected, even that of an orphanage in rural South Carolina. Connie Maxwell saw a number of older boys leave to go into the military. Some older girls also left before graduation to enter war industries and for other war-related activities. The orphanage was also selected to find sponsoring homes for British children sent abroad to escape German bombs. The loss of many refugees and the sinking of the Arendora Star by a German U-boat caused this program to be canceled. With his health failing, Jamison finally prevailed upon the board to bless his retirement in 1946 at age 79. This time he succeeded, but before leaving, Jamison had one more big contribution to make. He got board approval for a name change of the ministry from Connie Maxwell Orphanage to Connie Maxwell Children's Home. The new name reflected the reality that many children in care were not orphans, but also his belief that the mission was now not just one of care and education, but of treatment as well. Jamison died the following year, having had a profound impact on the organization he had led for 46 years. He also influenced the care of dependent children nationwide.
So history reveals the future. In this living room we're in right now, right outside is the porch where Jamison sat 3 days before he died, August 9, 1947. Dr. Smith and Dr. Murdoch visited him. He was mortally ill, and they knew it. And as they sat on the porch that day, Jamison said, as they left, Jamison said, "Boys, don't get in a rut. If the children need services that we don't have, go learn how to find them." And that voice from the past has informed our seeking. What do we need to find that's new, that's relevant to meet the needs of our children today? And basically at the command of Dr. Jamison's last words. He died 3 days after that on Saturday.
No one would have expected the young man who succeeded Jamison to leave a legacy its equal in either accomplishment or longevity. The children's home inherited by Sam Smith had some 225 children in care living in cottages of 15 children each. It had been Jamison's dream to reduce over time the number of children cared for in each cottage to less than 20 to ensure that each child received the individual attention needed. As his assistant, Smith selected the Reverend John Murdoch, who was already the pastor of the church.
He was a great preacher. He was very formal, wore a robe at church on Sunday morning. I can remember some of our church services, a dog would come in the church and he'd call somebody's name out to go get the dog and take him out. Our cat would come in and curl his tail around his leg and he'd look down and say, somebody come get this cat. And then he would stop preaching sometimes when the transfer truck would be coming down the road. He would stop preaching as the truck come over that hill coming down Highway 10. He would literally stop preaching until the truck went by and then he'd start back, because if he kept preaching, you got nobody here.
Together, these two men would work as a team to strengthen the ministry over the coming decades. Accomplishments of Smith's early tenure included the reestablishment of a small but effective Mother's Aid program to enable children in good but impoverished homes to stay with the family. Smith also expanded the foster care program. This program was focused on preventing preschool children from needing institutional care. Smith also sought to further reduce the number of children cared for in a single cottage to 10 to 12, while at the same time increasing the number of children for whom the home could care. To accomplish this goal, 5 new cottages were built.
He helped to start new works in child care, like having the smaller cottages, having that cottage mother so that there was a unit where they felt more like a family than they did, in an institution. And there's probably not been a more compassionate, more loving and gentle spirit on this campus than Sam Smith.
I instantly fell in love with him. He was just a kind, tender man.
By 1956, Connie Maxwell was caring for 286 children on its campus. This period of growth also saw extensive work to beautify the campus, renovate old cottages, and construct new support facilities.
So one of the things I remember about Dr. Smith was I played athletics at high school, Greenwood High School, played football. And if you played football, you had to do your work assignments before you went to school. So usually, if you played sports, you was at the office early in the mornings, about 6 o'clock, doing your work assignment that morning, because you wasn't going to be able to do it that afternoon. And what I remember about him is when you'd go in his office, regardless of what time it was in the morning, he was already at work. He always had a kind word for you, wanted to know how you was doing, how things was going. He was a great guy, very compassionate, a very loving person. Anybody that knew him knew that Dr. Smith was a great guy, truly a Southern gentleman. Treated you with dignity, treated you with respect. I loved him.
He had that kind of love that he projected out.
Well, Dr. Sam was always made everybody feel special, like they were the only ones here. He always knew everybody's name, and he was like just a kind giant of a father that you looked up to. Just always so, he seemed like a gentle giant. He was an awesome person, always encouraging. I just was privileged to have just some quality time that I got to spend with Dr. Sam Smith. You could tell that he really loved Connie Maxwell. He was Connie Maxwell.
While the number and variety of staff jobs increased during this period, the characteristics of the core staff position, the house mother, remained much the same as in previous decades. In 1956, their average age was 56, with 3/4 of them widows and very few married. Smith described the group as generally being women who were widows who have successfully reared their own families.
My mother died with cancer in 1951. I came with 5 brothers and a nephew. Miss Goins was a cottage mother. She was a strong, compassionate lady. Being that young, being away from your mother, being away from what you knew, it was hard. And I remember that I would cry night after night. I'd come home from school and go out on the screened-in front porch and cry. I remember Miss Goins would come out and console me.
Connie Maxwell was one of the first children's homes to recognize the importance of including the parent while working with the child. Social workers at Connie Maxwell approached the child's parent as a resource rather than as a person in need. By 1956, the home could boast that all but 3 of its children had at least some contact with parents or relatives. A major change in the education of children occurred in 1948. Previously, children in care attended school on the campus, but that year began to be integrated into the city's public schools. By 1958, all Connie Maxwell children would attend public school. The 1950s also saw a significant shift in the parental status of the children in care. In 1946, only 1/3 had both parents living, but by 1956, that number had risen to more than half. This shift toward caring more and more for children who had parents but needed care outside the home would continue through to the present day. More than at any time in its history, major cultural shifts began impacting the children's home in the 1960s. Although the decade began with optimism, it would see a decline in both finances and the scope of Connie Maxwell's programs. The early 60s saw continued growth and expansion with the construction of a beautiful new church building and a new cottage to replace 2 that were to be taken out of service. Work on planning a new activities building, which would open in 1970, also began. But the number of children in the children's home's various programs began declining by the middle of the decade. This was not so much because there was no longer a need for out-of-home care, but because societal pressures were increasing the trauma children were experiencing. No longer was it enough in many cases for children to find a loving home. Many also needed mental health treatment to overcome the trauma of abuse. As society changed, discipline and sexual relationships became greater issues, and more staff was required to meet children's needs. The children being taken into care were older on average, and many were coming after multiple placements in foster homes. At the same time, there began to be ominous financial rumblings as the number of churches making direct gifts to the ministry began to decline. Increased development efforts turned this around for a time, but the children's home was to gradually see its primary means of support shift away from churches to individual giving and endowment income. Another cultural shift came to the children's home in 1969 when the board and administration began planning to serve African American children. Although the home had long employed African Americans in various staff positions, the children in care to this point had all been white. A seemingly simple call by 21st century standards, the decision to integrate was more than a moral one in the 1960s. Some other denominational homes had begun a gradual process of integration since the passage of civil rights legislation earlier in the decade, but these tended to be supported by integrated denominations. Connie Maxwell also needed to take into consideration the desires of the predominantly black Educational and Missionary Convention, which was understandably jealous of its prerogatives to care for black children. Smith, desiring integration to be supported by both denominations and to be more than tokenism, insisted on the involvement of the black community in planning the integrated program. Dr. Ed Johnson, the pastor of the Morris Chapel Baptist Church in Greenwood, became the first black social worker at Connie Maxwell. First developing black foster homes and administering a Mother's Aid program, Johnson prepared the way for the full integration of the campus in 1977. By this time, the number of children in care was dropping at a rapid rate, falling to 150 in 1974 and 125 in 1977. The average length of stay was a little over 2 years, but for many children, the stay was substantially shorter. The 1970s also saw the first change in leadership for Connie Maxwell since Dr. A.T. Jamison's retirement in 1946. Now, in 1976, it was Sam Smith's turn to retire. He was careful to leave one day ahead of the employment record set by his mentor. As with Jamison, Smith's retirement was expected, and as with Jamison, the Board of Trustees already had a successor in mind. Dr. John Murdoch, Smith's right hand, who served long and well in the dual capacities of assistant superintendent and pastor of the church, took the reins of leadership in 1976. The plan was for the 60-year-old Murdoch to take the home forward and to recast its administration by identifying a younger person to lead when he himself retired. This was not to be, however. Just a year later, in March 1977, Murdoch died in his sleep while attending a childcare conference. He had served Connie Maxwell for 36 years. The vacuum created by Murdoch's death was relatively short. Seeking to move quickly, that September the board brought in a young man who would set a new direction for the ministry that was both in keeping with its heritage and suited to dealing with modern problems. Heyward Prince was just 35 years old when he took the helm of the Connie Maxwell ministry, a year younger than A.T. Jamison had been when he assumed leadership. Previously a school psychologist, Prince brought energy, fresh ideas, and an understanding of the problems facing children and families to the role.
His name said it all about him. He was a prince of a fellow. Enjoyed Heyward and really found him to be somebody who had a great vision for child care. He loved children, and he had a great ability to think ahead as to future possibilities for child care and for working with children.
Dr. Prince had children around my own age, so it was neat to see him as a father to me and a father to them. One of the kindest, gentlest souls. Just his whole presence was comforting, and he cared so much about us that lived here and what was best for us.
Prince entered at a time of transition for children's ministries. Numbers and new applications for care had continued to fall off precipitously, in part because children needing care had greater treatment needs than the traditional children's homes provided, and because of a wave of anti-institutionalism that was sweeping the country. The national emphasis had shifted to finding permanent homes for children other than institutional care, and on using growing government programs to care for the kind of child that homes like Connie Maxwell had served in the past.
Well, each era kind of is somewhat different, but the state seems to go through these up and down episodes of believing in what we're doing and then not believing in what we're doing and wanting to change the whole thing. And generally speaking, I think most of these state employees are motivated similarly to what children's home people are. They want to help children and families, but it's a matter of how to do that.
Prince and the board saw no value in seeking to buck the trends to merely maintain the status quo. Instead, they moved carefully to establish programs that would meet the needs of a new day. New services included crisis care homes in Greenwood and Greenville, a group home in Florence, and the placement of a regional social worker in Somerville to provide counseling, referral, and intake services for families in the Low Country. Connie Maxwell also began adventure-based counseling, which used ropes course challenges to teach trust and cooperation. The end result was that while the numbers of children in care at any one time on the Greenwood campus remained considerably lower than in the peak years of the 1950s, the ministry was working with more children and families than ever before. In 1990, the home had some level of contact with nearly 900 children and some 1,200 parents, relatives, and other interested persons. As Connie Maxwell celebrated its centennial in 1992, the ministry was looking to its second century with renewed optimism born of a revitalized vision. But early that year, tragedy struck once again. In February, Prince was on his way home after a morning in the office when he was involved in a horrendous traffic accident. Although he initially survived the crash, Prince succumbed to his injuries the following January at age 51.
I think a lot of the kids, including myself, we were all heartbroken because, all the presidents that we had here have been very good, but Heyward made a specific time period to come and speak with you. And that really means a lot to a kid when you got the president of the children's home coming down to talk to you. And he'd tell us things that we should do and what we shouldn't do, and how people should handle you and how you should gain respect if you're going places. And I know for a fact, without him, I wouldn't be able to hold a position or do the things that I do now, because I understand, like they said, I understand from a perspective that a lot of people never could. And with his passing, a lot of people had a hard time of it.
Following Prince's accident, Dr. Joseph Weber, the ministry's vice president for development, served as acting director and was later appointed president to lead the children's homes through its centennial celebrations and transition to new leadership. A longtime pastor, Weber had served at Connie Maxwell since 1987. Not willing to let progress stall following Prince's death, Connie Maxwell's board selected a children's home veteran, Dr. Jimmy McAdams, as the next president in the spring of 1993. Coming from the Georgia Baptist Homes for Children, a somewhat similar ministry to that of Connie Maxwell allowed McAdams to hit the ground running.
Of course, Dr. Prince had been disabled for some time, and I think Dr. Joe Weber, who served in an interim period, helped to deal with a lot of the grief that was present, particularly among the staff folks. So when we went, there was still some lingering grief, but I think there was a more evident was a desire to move forward, to not stagnate there, but to carry on that vision and that leadership that Dr. Prince had offered.
He led in the opening of another satellite campus in Orangeburg, where 16 boys and girls could live in 2 family-style cottages on a 140-acre campus.
Well, of course, always when you're serving children, there's always that desire underneath to have more places, more facilities to serve more children in better ways. And on my desk when I arrived at Connie Maxwell was a letter from the trustees of the Orangeburg facility saying, we want to talk to somebody there about the possibility of acquiring our program. So rather quickly, we agreed to acquire the assets of that program, including the land and the cottages. And it gave us the ability to serve children closer to their home locations in that region. And that program is still existing today and doing well.
He also oversaw the opening of the Neb Klein Family Service Center on the Greenwood campus. Housed in what was once known as the Eastern Star Cottage, The program works with children and families in an effort to meet needs so that residential care is not necessary. Oasis, an educational program located on the Connie Maxwell farm, was also begun during McAdams' tenure. McAdams closed his time of service in 2002 when he left to become president of the Florida Baptist Children's Homes.
He is a really great guy to be around, brought energy to a room. You know, everyone seemed to be in a better mood when he was around. Him and his wife. His wife was amazing.
This time, transition could be smooth and planned. McAdams handed over leadership to Ben Davis, who had long been associated with Connie Maxwell in various capacities. Davis, a businessman and former mayor of Fountain Inn, South Carolina, had served on the Board of Trustees and had worked throughout McAdams' tenure as the Business and Development Vice President. Davis continued the work begun by Prince and McAdams to make Connie Maxwell a statewide ministry that met the families where they were. A third crisis shelter, this one in Chesterfield, was opened in 2004. A family care program that allows mothers to live with their children for a time on the Connie Maxwell campus was also begun. One new twist in Davis's tenure was the role played by his wife. As Director of Volunteer Services, Holly Davis served alongside her husband, and the pair was seen throughout their tenure as a ministry team. Perhaps one of the most significant contributions made by Davis came in the decision to increase the ministry's endowment, a process that had begun during Prince's administration. Davis accelerated this effort both before and during his time as president. The businessman in him recognized that while ongoing support from donors would always be needed, it was important to establish a strong source of additional income to help the ministry during difficult times.
I truly felt in '93 when I came that God was saying to me, the Baptist money's not going to be there forever, and the state money's not going to be there forever. You need to find a way to get through those tough times. So we set out with a definite mission of trying to build our endowment. And the only way I knew to do that was to go to people individually and say, when you start thinking about setting your estate plans, we trust that you'll think about Connie Maxwell. Take care of your children and your family first, and your church second. But if there's anything else left that you could think about Connie Maxwell and the children, we would appreciate that. That basically was a good success. We had literally hundreds of people who began to put us into their wills and estates.
By the time he retired in 2014, endowment income was providing for about 40% of the Connie Maxwell budget. That foresight proved to be prescient as the children's ministry faced one of its greatest challenges when what became known as the Great Recession hit the nation in 2008. The recession coincided with a reduction of funding from the South Carolina Baptist Convention, which was dealing with wider financial challenges. Several children's ministries closed their doors during the time period, but Connie Maxwell's endowment enabled it to press on as it had through previous recessions, depressions, wars, and cultural shifts over more than a century.
I know today, and I truly believe, that the rank and file Baptists in the pews love Connie Maxwell and love our children and love the ministry as much as they ever have. But because churches have also experienced that same problem that the recession brought on, and that sadly the lack of denominational allegiance has brought on, churches aren't getting as much money, at least discretionary money, as they used to. So they've had to cut back on the support that at one time we got more fully. The convention's the same way. I think we have the support of the State Baptist Convention. But they are finding that cooperative program dollars are not coming to them as strongly as they once were, and the only thing you can do there is to cut back somewhere.
Concerned that continuing to accept state funds and partial payment for the care of children in state custody would lead to unacceptable infringement on the ministry's ability to share the Christian faith led the Board of Trustees to forego signing a contract with the state worth $750,000 in 2013.
We made the decision in May of 2013 that we just would not sign the state contract again, knowing that we might lose 40 or 50 children, knowing that we might lose $750,000 to $1 million. But we felt so strongly that we were getting some invasiveness on the Christian approach that we do, that this was the right thing to do.
Despite the loss in referrals and state funds, the children's ministry was a year later serving more children than it had under the state contract and was well on its way toward making up the lost state revenues through private donations. In September 2014, Connie Maxwell welcomed just its 9th president in 122 years of ministry. Randy Harling, pastor of Simpsonville First Baptist Church, and his wife Sherry had served as foster parents for the 8 years prior. He had started a foster care ministry through the church and served as a consultant on foster and adoption ministries.
What led me to another chapter of our lives here at Connie Maxwell was the beginning of foster parenting. About the time that Sherry, my wife, and I were heading into the empty nest with our 2 older boys, we started foster parenting boys. And that changed our life forever in a deep way. The level of victimization of children is at an all-time high in our society. We are a civilized society, but what we do to children is as barbaric as the 1st century. And that's the challenge that we all need to face sooner or later.
Harling's time at Connie Maxwell was relatively short, however, as he decided to leave the ministry in late 2016 and return to the pastorate, this time at Somerville Baptist Church. James Wright, former Chief Financial Officer for the South Carolina Baptist Convention, then provided leadership in an interim capacity. He provided stability and enabled the children's ministry to continue providing consistent quality during the search for a new leader.
I always have had a love and appreciation for Connie Maxwell, and it's just, for me, an unexpected blessing to be able to serve as an interim president here. My desire has been to create a bridge of continuity and work with the staff and keep things moving forward.
Dr. William D. Danny Nicholson was selected to serve as Connie Maxwell's president in September 2017. An adopted child himself who was abandoned as a baby, Nicholson brought expertise in educational leadership and policy to the children's ministry. He was also a proven fundraising leader, having served in university advancement for 8 different institutions of higher education, including the Medical University of South Carolina, Coker College, and Carson Newman University.
February 26, 1962, I was born alone, which means that there was no one there to pick me up. But a maintenance worker and a school teacher came to Barley Hospital in Hartsville, South Carolina, picked me up, took me home, and gave me an absolutely wonderful life. God completed the circle in my life. He said, I want you to just go give other kids what I gave you on February 26, 1962. I want you to give them home. I want you to love them. I want you to make them feel safe in their own backyard.
Nicholson believes that while Connie Maxwell will need to continue adapting to the times, the core mission will not change.
We're not orphanages anymore. We grew and evolved out of a changing world. And so there's so much chaos and brokenness in the family in our society today that it's changed the whole nature of how we minister to children. The whole complexion of the home and our institution has changed. Part of that is because there's so much abuse, there's so much addiction, there's so much increased trauma that kids have experienced that there's more immediate crisis. The level of brokenness, I think, is higher than ever before. And so that really changes the way we minister and seek to heal children, because it's a different kind of brokenness in our society today. Because there's a different brokenness, we are continuously having to evolve and to ask ourselves prayerful questions like, what is relevant for healing a child today? What is going on around them? How has it profoundly affected their lives?
In the end, the true success of the children's ministry must be measured in lives that have been changed.
So if it had been for Connie Maxwell, honestly, I would have been on the other side of the fence. So that I look back toward it. I'm happy, I'm proud to have received the training that I've had here at Connie Maxwell.
I keep telling people I'm gonna write a book. 3 times a winner and never a loser. And Connie Maxwell was the first, that was a winning situation for me.
I really cannot imagine my life without it. Excuse me. But when I think about the path that it's taken me down, it's remarkable. The people that were put before me, each person had a purpose.
To be totally honest with you, I'm who I am today because of Connie Maxwell. The 6 brothers that came to Connie Maxwell are better off today financially, mentally, and spiritually than the ones that didn't have the same opportunity that we had. Words, I don't have words in my heart to say how much I appreciate and love Connie Maxwell.
Seeing the little children that suffer, that didn't have the opportunity that I had, gives me more of an appreciation for Connie Maxwell and makes me want to every day show that these people didn't waste their time giving their lives to take care of us and provide for us a home, security, and love, and teach us a sense of responsibility.
Everything around my life that has happened that is awesome has come from Connie Maxwell. As far as shaping and molding, without a doubt, it was in God's plan for my life. It has been one of the best things that has ever happened to me. I am proud to be a part of it and will sing its praises to my end.
You know, without Connie Maxwell, I wouldn't be the person that I am today. You know, I wouldn't have worked as hard as I did in school, wouldn't have, put the extra work in athletics, and wouldn't have gotten to see the world from those decisions I made. And I'm just thankful for the opportunity to stay here. That could have been any other place I could have stayed, and they could have chose any other kid to come here. But the fact that they extended their time to me and my brother, I'll always be thankful for that.